You're listening to The Roots, a podcast from Minnesota AMA District 23 ARMCA. I'm your host, Jackie Reese. Let's dive deeper into what makes our district so great. This podcast was prepared by an independent contractor and may not be the views of the Board of Directors of District 23 ARMCA or any of their sponsors or affiliates. Welcome, everybody, to episode 8 of The Roots with Matt Stavish. Matt, I'm glad we finally got to sit down and do this podcast.
What do you mean, finally?
Well, I've been after you for a couple months now to get you on here.
And I have been told I've been hard to nail down by more than a couple of people, but I know the first time you wanted to talk to me, I had a pretty good crash at Millville and bonked my head really good, and my shoulder was really funky, and that week was just not very good. But I it really wasn't that bad. But at my age, I'm trying to be cautious, and I don't mean to sound like an old person, but I like being healthy, and yeah, I had a bad crash that week, which was I think like a month ago.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially when you hit your head, that's nothing to mess around with. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. It seems like that's a injury that is, we're learning more and more about. It's super duper serious. And yeah, I have a close friend that I grew up with that raced a bunch, and he's had some issues, and he swears it's from 2 different first corner crashes at Cambrian. Like hardcore concussions, back when helmets weren't much of anything. And, if you were knocked out for a couple of minutes, you got up and went out for the second race, which, now we seem to know a lot better than that.
Right. Absolutely. So I've had requests for you to be on the podcast, which is fantastic. People want to hear your story. Let's start at the beginning. Where did motorcycling start for you, and how did you come across enduro of all disciplines?
Well, my dad did it, and I was really young, and I had a Honda 50, and he had a big bike and sitting in the garage, and I'd get on the back with him sometimes, but it just seemed so, large, being a little kid, and there weren't a whole lot of choices back then for mini bikes, and there weren't, a whole lot of there wasn't a lot of mini racing going on. So it was always kind of around, and I thought it was cool. And I rode a little bit of a Honda 50 in my neighborhood. I grew up in Blaine, which was by the time I got in high school, Blaine was a complete off-road mecca. And it's hard to imagine, but I had like a dozen motocross tracks that I could ride at from my parents' house in high school.
Wow.
Good, big motocross tracks. So I feel bad for kids growing up now. You have to know somebody with property, you have to load up and go to a track and pay. So I remember my dad took me to a motocross at Spring Creek. I think it was like 79. I was like, hey, this is pretty cool. And he asked me, do you want to do this? Do you think and I was like, yeah, I'd like to do it. Let's go. So I was probably 11 years old then, 79. Yeah. And then later and I was pretty excited about it. Later that summer, he took me in an enduro, and it was in St. Cloud, maybe Sauk Rapids. And I was blown away. It was like, I can't believe this. Guys are out in the middle of the woods, going down trails, crossing rivers. And, and it was all adults. There was no kids doing it back then. And, and he said, well, we could get you into this. And I was like, whoa, I don't know if I could do this. And, in like the next year, 1980, I started dabbling in it a little bit. I probably really didn't finish any races till, like maybe 82 or 83. And I know that sounds kind of crazy, but, they were big, long races, and they weren't set up for, kids. So it was like the ultimate struggle. But I stayed with it and had fun. And by 86, the year I graduated high school, I won the enduro championship and I had a lot of fun that summer. I had a blast racing all the enduros. And then in 80, 87, 88, 87, I dabbled in a couple of national enduros, like regionally, and did okay. And then in 88, I qualified for my first 6 days and went to France, which was like the experience of a lifetime for a 20-year-old. And my dad didn't come with me; he just turned me loose and said go. So that was 88, and then 80, 89, I dabbled in national enduros a fair amount. 90, I went to 6 days again on the junior team as a KTM factory rider. And then rode the national enduros pretty steadily, for like the next decade. And I never did real well. I was like a top 5 guy, but really enjoyed it. Had a lot of fun. And the events were big and long back then. They were coast to coast, 100-mile, minimum 100-mile races until I think 1988. So I raced in, Washington State, California, Maine, Georgia, every place in between. And whereas now it seems like the series are a lot more regionally based, which is cool, I guess. But I liked enduros because you got to sample all the different landscape types, across the entire country. That's what I liked about it. And I like racing hare scrambles. I like close course racing still, but I'm glad I got to do it when I did it, because it's a little bit different now. It's more condensed. There isn't nearly as much, there's no enduros in the West at all, no national enduros. And GNCCs are kind of the main series right now off-road in the country, and that's very regional. I mean, that's a super regional series, really. Yeah, so I've had fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Got to see the world riding motorcycles. I think that's any motorcyclist's real dream, right? Let's go back to when you were a kid and it was difficult to finish the enduros. Now, for people that may not be familiar with enduro at the time, why was it so difficult to finish them?
Well, I was just a little kid, but you had to work on your bike during the events. Some guys like carry chains, in their fanny packs, because that was a common thing to break a chain. And like not having brakes for half the race was, pretty normal thing. Whereas now, like if my brakes don't work, I'm everything's got to be working for me now. But the events were longer, but and don't get me wrong, maybe they weren't all that tough as compared to now, because the bikes are so much better now. You don't have to work on the bikes. The suspension is so much better. The motors are better, so you can get through the terrain a lot easier with a lot less effort.
Right. Yeah, it's incredible how far we've come, right? And in the time that you've been doing this. And let's talk about 6 days a little bit more. I want to hear stories from France when you were 20. It sounds like you had an incredible trip. Riding motorcycles seemed awesome, but I'm sure there are also extracurricular activities that could have been pretty fun on that trip also.
I went with my cousin Joe Zierman, that year, and his dad, Tim, was a big influence on my racing too, along with a lot of guys from that generation, guys that are in their 80s now or would be in their 80s now, like Dale Greenwall and Al Mathwig and Floyd Martineau, Barney Larson, just those four guys we've lost recently, and they've had a huge influence on the district.
Absolutely.
And when I was growing up doing it, they were laying out courses, supporting me, showing me how to use a machete in the woods. It was really cool.
Absolutely.
Oh,
So
you were asking about stories about 6 days. And
yeah,
6 days is awesome. It's the biggest out event in the world, and and if you've ever been to a GNCC, it's like a GNCC for 6 days in a row. That much atmosphere, that much intensity, that much racing, 6 days in a row. But it's super cultural. I recommend it to anybody. And there's Nathan Furter and Nick Swenson are going this year, and I got a good story about Nick Swenson. Steve Swenson and I went to Portugal in 1999, and it was my fourth trip to Europe, my fourth 6 days, his first. And his wife Darcy was at home, pregnant with Nick, who is now doing his first 6 days this year, which is pretty cool. I think it's kind of the first father-son 6 day guys from Minnesota, from the district. I'm sure. Yeah, which is awesome.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. It's a great storyline to see that Nick is continuing that trend of going into off-road racing like his dad did. I want to hear about France. I'm sorry, I'm going to push you, but we know, like, from I'm from the motocross side of things. Motocross of Nations in France is, the fans are incredible. How was your experience with the fans when you were there?
Right. Yeah, and that was a big thing. When I got there, I couldn't believe, riding the event, how many people lined the course, all day, every day, in the middle of nowhere, going through villages, in special tests at the Parc Fermé, in the work areas. It's a sea of humanity, and to ride through the work area, you just have to hold your bike wide open, and the sea would just part because so many people, and you get through the crowd to try to get to the area to get to work on your bike. And people are, France is an enduro country, and Italy is very much also, and probably more. And I've always wanted to do a 6 days in Italy, and I never got the chance. I did not try this year for a multitude of reasons, but I doubt very much I could have straight up qualified. It would have been pretty dang tough.
Tough, but not impossible. You've done it a few times before, right?
Yeah, and I think I have the 6 days of riding in a row, but everything else that goes along with it, just the time and effort and commitment, I've done, and I'm happy I did it. But never say never, but it's getting close. It is getting close to saying never.
Yeah. Let's move into more of your experience with the National Enduros back when it was across the entire country. Which was your favorite race that you attended in the United States?
My favorite enduro, without a doubt, was Clear Creek, Coalinga, California. Which was Clear Creek. It was a public riding area. It's closed now. It's maybe halfway between Los Angeles and San Francisco in the coastal range. Just really unique terrain, super long, remote, um, remote to the point where, the majority of years you had to make sure you could go 40 miles on a tank of gas. Remote to the point where pit crews could not get out to service you. And I raced that event probably 14 or 15 times. And I would say half of the times were in snow.
Wow.
Like the course completely covered in snow. So I like, and sometimes it would be bone dry dust too, but it just really, really good, unique landscape. But it was asbestos mining. So I guess, the government deemed it not safe for people to recreate in.
Right.
So that's gone. But I enjoyed them all. I raced a couple enduros in Washington State. But I think about it now, and it just seems surreal that they even had them, because I don't think there are very many. There's only a couple enduros left in Washington, and they're pretty small and condensed. And these were, like big 100, 120 mile enduros that were super tough. And the East Coast had their own flavor too. There was a club in Rhode Island that did a super good job. Maine had a good national enduro. Delaware State had and I think Delaware is still going on, but Delaware State had a really long, tough national enduro too. That was cool. And Minnesota had some awesome national enduros too. Paul Bunyan was a national 97, 98, and 99. That was really, really cool.
Awesome. How does it when you're out there on the course, nobody can reach you, it's just you and the motorcycle. What's your favorite part about that? What is that feeling like for you when there's no one around and it's just you and the bike?
Yeah, I guess, and it's not much. There aren't very many like that anymore. But yeah, just a sense of adventure and self-reliance and just solitude, and just trying to tackle the terrain. And it's different than lining up at a hair scrambler cross country when there's 20 guys that are racing for the first corner. It's a different type of race, and I do like them both, but I national enduros were cool, and I think I did them at the best point in the history of the sport, because the bikes were good enough that you didn't have to work on them the entire time. Everybody was pretty much finishing. Mechanical DNFs were getting to the point where they didn't happen much. Whereas right when I started, it was, like I said, people were carrying chains in their fanny packs. And then I got into the late 90s, early 2000s, and the events got shorter, more condensed. And it is still a really good test. It's just different.
Mm-hmm.
But when I was doing, during the 90s, early 2000s, the events were still really long, but the bikes were good enough that you didn't have to work on them the whole time. So it was kind of the best of both worlds. Whereas now the bikes are so good, you can race like 3 races in a row and not really have to do anything to the bikes in between the races sometimes, because the dang bikes are so good, and the events are 60 or 70 miles.
Right. So why do you think that change happened? Why did they go from a fully national series with really long races to more regional series and shorter races? How did that kind of come about for the series itself?
That's a good question. I've wondered that, and I've been told it's because of travel expenses is part of it, is why they're keeping it regional. But then I look at the rigs that people are driving the races, and it's like, I don't see any shortage of money.
Right.
I mean, you go to races now, whereas 20 years ago, you would have thought you were in the pits of a country music concert. That's what people are driving now is, Greyhound, bus motorhomes. So to say it's about expenses and money, I don't I don't buy that. I think it's more of a cultural thing. First of all, to lay out those races um, is a huge endeavor, and I've helped a little bit here and there, put on races, but to put on a full on 100-mile national enduro is a really really big endeavor, and I don't, I just don't. Those guys don't exist. Like I said, I just mentioned before, four guys that we've lost recently that did that kind of stuff. So I think some of it's cultural, and people tend to want things that are a little easier packaged. It seems like a little easier to put into a sound bite, maybe. Um, yeah,
Yeah.
that's the only thing I can think. And land use is a huge thing too. It's the the bureaucracy of laying out those long of race courses are that's got to be tough.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Right. So that's part of it too.
Yeah. That's so it sounds like you have some experience um with making these courses, and in my no
Not much.
experience? Okay.
No, I mean a little bit, not much. I've never been the trail bossman in enduro. I helped get a national to Duquette in 2008 and worked with the straight arrows doing that. And I've used the machete and brush saw in the woods a little bit, but I mean there are guys that have spent decades, in the woods doing nothing but clearing trail. Like Todd Mathwood comes to mind. Cannot imagine the amount of hours he has behind a brush saw. He and the whole Martinson clan too. I've done it a little bit, so I can appreciate what it takes. But I've never did the whole thing.
Gotcha.
Maybe
Why
maybe someday. It is something to aspire. It
yeah.
is.
Why do you think that tradition wasn't exactly passed down to people, say my age, or that sense of volunteering and community and building up the trail system nowadays?
Well, and it has been passed down. And there are a ton of people out there still doing it and still working. I mean, and we have really good events here in District 23, and that's only because of the people that are putting them together and working on them. I've been all over the country, and our district has really really high quality events, and that's only because of the people that are behind the scenes doing the work, all the trail bosses, all the people laying it out, cutting the brush, doing all the necessary work to get it together. So I mean, it has been passed down, and I 20 or 25 years ago, when Floyd was laying out trail in the Paul Bunyan forest, I think he had a little bit more free reign. Well, I
Mm.
know he had a lot of free reign. You could just go make trail, put arrows on it, have a race. But now it's there's a pretty big process to get new trail put in it and approved. And that's a government thing,
Mhm.
and and that does not happen very often.
Right. Yeah. I in the board meetings I get to hear Tom and Karen talk about um
Uh,
if we've been working on getting these 10 miles of trail for the past 10 years. So yeah, that's understandable that it is definitely more difficult now, not for lack of people trying, but those pioneers had an extra desire to make something great out of it, right?
And I talked to somebody once that had a hand in laying out the first Nickerson Duquette Enduro, and he told me there were no authorities involved in that in the least. I mean, the sheriffs weren't even notified. They just went and laid out a course and had an event. So it was a lot more Wild West then. And there's just as much work going into it now. It's just a different type of work. Like
Right.
you said, like Tom and Karen, doing all the groundwork, the footwork to try to keep it going.
Absolutely. The maybe not quite so fun. I'm sure they enjoy it, but having to go to meetings
They
all
must.
day and
They have to enjoy it because they're good at it. So
yeah,
they've got to dig it.
yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Um, so what do you see for the future of off-road racing here in Minnesota? We have, lots of up and comers, a couple guys going off to 6 days here. Where do you see the future going here specifically in Minnesota?
I I think, and I'm not advocating for it, but I think the events will be more promoter based. It's happened at a national level for all off-road racing. Um, and there's Gary Walton is starting in here with Border Battle. And I'm not saying that's better or worse. I just think that is the direction it's going. Um, sprint enduros, I think, are going to be more into play than real enduros, although I think they need to change the name to sprint off road. I mean, the word enduro was obviously derived from endurance, and yeah, and I would like to see the GP format, or I shouldn't say I'd like to see it. I don't particularly enjoy the GP format, but I think it's a good. I think it's a good alternative for smaller tracks that can't have a full on hair scrambles. Um, like like anything under like 7 miles with the A's and B's on it at the same time can get pretty crowded. Whereas, the GP format with two 30-minute motos and two motos, you can, you can use a little bit smaller area, and not have such a disparity um, in skill level out on the track at the same time. Wisconsin has adopted it. I think Illinois has adopted it. Yeah. So I think that's probably gonna, and it's a good bridge between, motocross is pretty short. I mean, I think you could probably go to a motocross race and fill your stock tank up, do practice in your two motos, and you don't even need to bring a gasket. But
Yes.
those guys look at 2-hour hair strip, and not that that's not a skill. I mean, going super fast, hard out for 8 or 10 minutes at a time, that is a skill. But I think sometimes people want a little bit more ride time. But a lot of those moto guys look at hair scrambles, and say, 2 hours is a long time to ride. Do I have to put a big tank on? Do I have to put those bark buster things on? Do I have to set up my suspension for rocks? Whereas the GP format, which is just two 30-minute motos on a natural terrain track, which is just what motocross used to be in the 60s. Guys look at that, and that's something that's a little bit more doable. And I think the younger generation, off-road guys like that format too. It's successful on the J-Day off-road series. They do a really good job.
Yeah, it sounds intriguing to me, right? I've raced one hair scramble in my life. And I ended up making it that whole hour and a half, which I had an extra lap, so I ended up going an hour and a half on
It
my.
is a long time. That's a long
It
time to
is,
be.
but I
Yeah,
made
you
it.
have to pace yourself. Yeah,
I made it on one tank of gas, which I'm
cool.
shocked by, which I was not expecting to have to do that last lap, and was not planning a pit stop or anything. So I'm glad that I made it an hour and a half on a tank of gas. But the the GP format does intrigue me, right? Like it's a good way for someone who has grown up in motocross to dip their toes into riding off
Right,
road and
right,
something different to do. And like you've mentioned, J Day, I've heard of good things about J Day, and there can be people who really excel at that, but may not super excel at hardcore off-road racing or motocross. But when you put them together, they're fantastic at it. So I think it's really cool just to bring more people into both aspects of riding, right? And
right,
all we ever want is to have more people enjoy what we're doing. So
right,
um, yeah, I think it's cool. And I agree with your point earlier that we have incredible events here, that everybody tries so hard and we have such high standards. And that really goes back to the board of directors and the group of people that volunteer their time. And
right.
I don't think many people understand that it's a lot of volunteer hours. It's not paid. So um, I guess, to my point here, why do you think it's important for people to stay active and volunteer with local riding and racing?
Well, I mean, it's a labor of love, and the only way it's going to happen is if if people keep it going. Which here it definitely it is still happening, and I see it going on for the next generation is coming up, and um, yeah, and everybody seems to be doing their part to keep this district at a super high standard. Yeah, and a good example, Nathan Furter just moved to Bend, Oregon, um, and I mean, they have cool races out there, but they don't have a full on put together series where like every event you go to, you are assured of a full on quality event with good competition. It has all the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted at all of our events. Whereas you go to other places in the country, it's like, yeah, they got some pretty cool trail, pretty cool terrain, but they couldn't quite score or market or yeah, there's always a catch, and I'm convinced D23 is like is without a doubt one of the best, if not the best districts in the country.
Yeah, I am biased, but I would say I agree.
Yeah.
So you still choose to race here in District 23. Why do you enjoy that, and why is that something that you continue to do?
I've never found anything more fun. No, yeah, I've just never found anything more fun. And I have not been racing much lately. I need to go buy a new bike this week, like my fourth 2021 model, um, because Kensington Hare Scrambles is this weekend, and I know, and like all the events around here, they do a super cool job. So yeah, I'm ready to get back out there. I plan on getting back out there. I haven't found anything more fun. Yeah, it's satisfying to race, and yeah, and the people and the competition is what keeps me coming back.
Absolutely. So we were pretty modest with your accomplishments during your professional career. But for kids who may look up to you, or young adults, or even other vet riders that look up to you in your career, what advice do you have for them in their own racing careers?
That's you have to enjoy it, but everybody has something different that makes them tick. Some some people go about it at a really, mellow and relaxed, they just go about it easy. Like Craig Lassa comes to mind. He rides flawlessly. He doesn't train a whole lot, but that's what works for him. And he has racked up, tons of championships in the district because he just really enjoys riding. Whereas me, I I feel like, I need to do a little bit of training like every single day. Um, and if I don't do something every single day, whether it be, just some moderate stretching if I'm completely beat up, or, a 40-mile off-road mountain bike pedal alone, I don't feel right. But everybody has to find what makes them tick, what keeps them going. And everybody has a different combination.
For sure. How did you figure out what made you tick? How did you figure out that you want to work out and train every day? Was it always a thing for you, or did you figure it out more so in your young adult life? How did it all come about for you?
And 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 when I was in my teens, I I took a much lighter approach at it. I did, and I had fun in my teens and early 20s, and I paid attention a little bit, but I look back now and maybe kind of wish I would have, paid a little bit more attention to it. But if I would have put a ton of effort into it, maybe I wouldn't be doing it now. Maybe I would have been more, but maybe I would have been burnt out by now. Um, but yeah, you just have to figure out what makes you tick. And some guys need to pound out 30-minute motos, 3 or 4 times a week, or it doesn't work for them. And some guys just need to go about it really casually, and that's what's good for them. And all you can do is experiment to try to find out, what works for you. And I still haven't figured out what works for myself totally. I mean, that's why it's still, yeah, I still try different things, training wise, to try to figure out what works for me.
Awesome. Well, it has been a pleasure talking to you, and I'm sure everyone who has listened to the whole thing has been very interested in your story. So thank you so much, Matt.
Well,
And
thank you, Jackie. It's really cool that you're doing this. It's awesome. I appreciate it. Cool.
thank you. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in to episode 8 of The Roots with Matt Stavish. We will see you in 2 Mondays.
See ya.
Thanks for joining us. Catch us every other Monday wherever you get your podcasts, as well as on our YouTube page.